Gawain sat back with a sigh. Reading through these logs was like studying a catalogue of failures. Out of all the experimentations they had carried out, only 20% were successful. Gawain stacked the papers and placed them neatly into a folder. He stashed it to the side. His mind was whirring with the strangeness around him. Lauren and the greater world, she looks like Earth, but underneath her lies a completely different set of physics. The planet he lived upon now was like a fraternal twin to Earth. She had a similar face and outward traits, but her fingerprints, bone structure, and even genetics had immutable differences. The hoot of an owl outside broke Gawain's reverie for the first time in a while. He walked over to the tent flap and peeked outside. A soothing nighttime hung over the camp. The fever of a workday had ceased, and of the 800 people there, most had retired to their various tents. Some sat at campfires to sing songs or tell stories. Gawain smiled to himself. He didn't need to participate in a song circle to see the seeds of civilization being planted before his very eyes. Bits of joy were the beautiful flowers that grew out of a well-tended garden. However, Gawain did not choose to wash up and go to bed. On the contrary, his hours-long reverie left him in a fighting mood. Gawain walked into the night, and his feet carried him to the newly built water wheel, which spun gently under the evening flow of the White River. He paced up and down the banks of the river, his mind as usual filled with mysteries he couldn't begin to unpack. In his worldview, all things should have some sort of underlying regulation or laws. Nature could be breathtakingly beautiful, but it would be a poor scientist indeed who refused to study it due to reverence. Since magic exists in this world, then I should factor it into my understanding of this world's scientific principles. This assertion stood to reason. After all, Earth had winds, rain, thunder, and lightning. All of those could be seen as magical to an outsider. So in Lauren, magic was just part of nature's cycle. Wrapped up in this new approach, Gawain whispered to himself, "So my experience on Earth is not useful in the details, but I can use the same mode of thinking. Break the constraints of this medieval world." He returned to his tent. Though he wasn't able to make cement or gunpowder, some of his past life could still be of use. Gawain went to his desk and retrieved a pair of transparent crystals. He had ordered them specially from a craftsman in Tanzan town. Though a citizen of the Anzu kingdom would think of them only as oddly shaped crystals, Gawain thought of them differently. They were lenses, one convex, one concave. Gawain held them to his eyes, measuring carefully the distance between his hands. Eventually the pillows, sacks and piles of equipment came into view on the other end. Gawain smiled. The speed of light might be different here, but at least it behaves similarly. Civilians might not be able to cast a magical eagle vision, but they still will be able to use telescopes. He just had to further lower the cost of constructing the man-made crystals and settle the problem of the low efficiency of manual polishing. Besides optical phenomena, the successful operation of the water wheel also proved one point in this world. Although the basic laws of the microcosmic field might be different from Earth's, some direct macroscopic laws of physics probably did not differ much from his native planet. Only further experiments would determine what worked and what didn't. Gawain scratched out a note about telescopes on his parchment. He blinked and his vision became blurry. Soon he felt himself overpowered by a colossal yawn. He listened outward. The camp seemed to have quieted entirely. Apart from those soldiers on watch, everyone must have gone to sleep. Gawain Cecil's body had excellent hearing. He could even hear Amber and Betty snoring in a nearby rudimentary hut. Even in her sleep, Amber was muttering to herself about gold and riches. Gawain shook his bleary head. It was really time to wash up and go to bed now. Gawain left his tent and went to the river again. There he filled a basin full of water. He cleaned his teeth and washed his face and then walked back toward his tent. As the night deepened, the last bits of light in the camp were extinguished. A tranquil darkness enveloped them, just like the draperies of Amber's Lady Night. Gawain smirked. Let's hope this goddess of shadows does indeed protect dreamers. Gawain returned to his tent and lay down on his bed. It wasn't long before he surrendered into a deep slumber. But as the Grand Duke slept, he didn't notice that beside his desk, something glowed. Tiny rays of light seemed to glimmer out of the pile of slag. Rebecca's failed cement glowed. Meanwhile, the militiamen on watch patrolled the dark camp. Since nothing yet had attacked in the night, they meandered about lazily, barely fending off sleep themselves. A pair of them walked down the paths, holding torches aloft to light their way. One was tall with a rotund belly, and the other was short and skinny. Each of them held a spear. The magic armor that Gawain had retrieved from the treasure vault glowed with a faint magical light, not quite enough to illuminate the path, but enough to make them feel important. They passed by the tent where the mysterious Gondolian sphere resided, and rejoined their captain. The head of the watch was a middle-aged man with a greying beard. He gestured toward the tent they had just passed. "Is the thing sleeping?" The tall militiaman snorted. "What else does a rock do but sleep?" His companion chuckled. Their captain shrugged. The short one chirped up. "I really don't see the use of us guarding it. It's just a rock ball and hasn't stirred. Even with Dame Heidi going there every day to cast spells on it." The squad leader's eyes narrowed in the flickering torchlight. "Do you have a problem with the Grand Duke's order?" The short guard seemed to shrink even further. "Of course not, of course not." The militia captain tapped the little man on his helmet. "Don't forget that he's responsible for this fine kit you're wearing. Did you ever think you'd be dressed like a knight?" The other two chuckled. The tall one grunted. "Yes, I think the look suits us rather well." The captain nodded and clicked his tongue. "Don't look forward to the day you have to use it. Come on then. Let's have a look at the rock. Then you two can welcome the new shift." The tall and short militiamen nodded excitedly, clearly eager to go back to their places of rest. Their tents and makeshift houses were not palaces, but they were undeniably preferable to a night shift. The captain and his two guards entered the tent. The sphere sat in the midst of the canvas. Its diameter was about 5 feet. Serfs had dug a divot into the ground to make sure that the ball wouldn't roll away from its location. And all around it, there were thick wooden stakes. Dame Heidi had strung magical thread from stake to form a little makeshift rope fence around the ball. In the inky black darkness, the thread glowed slightly. The captain strode over to a desk, which sat near the edge of the tent. There were alchemical potions, magical crystals, and other assorted clutter one would expect of a mage's workstation all strewn about it. He moved one of the crystals and took a look at Heidi's notes. Meanwhile, the guards walked around the sphere, looking at it closely. The captain spoke to them without looking up from the pad of paper. "Any change?" The tall soldier with the rotund belly grunted. He looked at the surface and resisted the urge to tap the item with his sword. "I thought a relic of Gondolier would be more impressive." His skinny friend guffawed, but a glare from the captain quieted them both. "Just check to see if there are any cracks on the surface, or if it has moved at all. Then leave when you're done." The soldiers began their checks while mumbling to themselves. Meanwhile, the squad captain freely surveyed the furnishings in the tent. Yet just as the captain looked away, he felt the hairs on his body standing up. The air seemed to have grown thick with crackling energy. The militia captain was no ordinary volunteer. He had survived the catastrophe at Castle Cecil, so he was always on high alert. He seized his sword and turned. Something's wrong. But as he turned around, the air ceased its strange crackling. The guards looked around nervously, their knuckles turned white from gripping their spears so hard. The short, skinny guard gulped. "Captain, I think you're being paranoid." The captain held up his hand, shushing his man. "No, I felt something strange." Just then the glowing light from the tall soldier's breastplate vanished. The skinny soldier gasped. "Locke, your breastplate!" Locke lowered his head for a look and cried out in surprise. Then the light returned. The 3 militiamen looked at each other, thoroughly baffled. Before they could say anything, their armor began flickering again. It wasn't just Locke's this time. The skinny militiamen and the captain, all of their armor began blinking like a dying fire. The captain drew his sword. Even his enchanted sword flashed like distant lightning. He grunted, "Stay calm, we'll slowly retreat out of the tent." He stopped speaking. A strange force felt like it was tugging at his sword. The captain resisted. He pulled back, but the force only increased. It felt like a pair of incredibly strong hands had seized his weapon by the blade and would not relinquish its hold. He turned his head toward Locke. "Locke, go fetch someone." Locke rushed toward the door but then stopped. Still struggling with his longsword, the captain barked at the tall soldier. "Locke, what are you doing?" "I can't move." Just then, Locke flew into the air. He shouted in terror, and his body hurdled the 8 feet between the tent's entrance, and he stuck right on the Gondolian sphere. The captain grunted, sweat pouring down his head. The force tugging at his sword suddenly became too much for him to endure. His blade seemed to wrench itself from his hand and spun towards the sphere. Locke shrieked as his captain's sword stuck to the ball a hand's breadth away from his face. The skinny, short soldier was rooted to the spot. His armor wasn't pulled, but terror kept him truly in place. That night, Clan Cecil awoke to the sounds of screams. "The sphere is alive!" Gawain sat bolt upright in bed. The sounds of commotion and guards running and shouting woke him instantly. Gawain threw on a tunic and grabbed the sword of the founder, which he always kept within arm's reach. Gawain pushed out of the tent. The sky was still dark, though the faint grey of early morning had started to begin. There must be only 2 hours until sunup. Sir Philip jumped back as Gawain exploded from his tent. "Your Excellency, there's something wrong with the sphere." "That ball you brought from the ruins?" Gawain furrowed his brow. "Something wrong? What do you mean by that?" The normally confident young man gritted his teeth. He seemed at a loss for words. Gawain nodded. "I see. It's complicated." Gawain cocked his head. He sensed a presence nearby. Amber appeared out of the shadows right next to him. Her short black hair was dishevelled, and she wore a plain tunic and trousers, not the usual leather armor she went about it. She started to walk forward, but stopped. Her leg was still submerged in darkness. "What's happening? What's going on?" "I was sleeping. Help me, please. I'm stuck. I'm stuck. Give me a hand." Gawain rolled his eyes. He grabbed Amber by her collar and lifted the rogue out of the shadows. "A shadow master like you can get caught in their own shadow walk." Amber shook herself free of Gawain's grip. She dusted herself off and averted her eyes, looking somewhat embarrassed. "I was in a hurry, not completely awake." "Well, what's wrong? What's going on?" Gawain gestured at Sir Philip. "Apparently something happened with the sphere. Come on, let's go have a look." Amber nodded slowly. She yawned. "Oh, the sphere. Well, I don't think you need me for that." Before she could finish her thought, Gawain picked her up and stashed her in the crook of his arm. He turned to Sir Philip. "Lead on." The single tent at the south of the camp was surrounded by soldiers and militiamen. They had formed a defensive line at least 10 feet from the entrance to the tent. Their burning torches had the area as bright as daytime, and the civilians in this southern part of the camp had been awakened by the stir here, but almost none dared to walk out of their tents to check the situation. Most huddled in their tents in fear. Gawain joined this situation with Amber struggling under his arm. Dame Heidi was already there, walking around the tent, waving her staff in the air. Magic runes were appearing, glowing images floating between the guards and the tent. She did a double take when Gawain arrived. "Ancestor!" Gawain set down the half-elf. "This one has better senses than ours in the night, but she was too sleepy to come. She needed motivation." Amber shook her fists and stood on tiptoes facing the far taller Gawain. "You almost strangled me. Is anyone going to stand up to this blatant injustice?" She looked around. No one did. Gawain cleared his throat. "How is the situation inside?" Sir Philip's face before had been ambiguous. But compared to Heidi's half-smile, her cocked head, and her twisted eyebrows, it was nothing. She seemed to know both more and less at the same time, so Gawain cut to the chase. "Are there casualties?" She shook her head. "No, 2 militiamen and a guard captain are trapped inside. They've been attracted, stuck." Gawain's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Attracted? Like by a magnet?" Heidi waved her hands in a confused gesture. "Similarly, but different." A militiaman apparently noticed that the enchanted equipment on them seemed to be acting strangely, losing their magical abilities. Then their armor and weapons were drawn to the sphere, as if by magnetism. But not everything was pulled. It was like the object itself was targeting certain things. I forbade anyone from going near it until we know more. Only Pittman is in there checking on the militia who are stuck. Gawain nodded slowly. Selective attraction. Affecting magic, too. It can't be a magnet, but what sort of thing would have such power? Gawain unbuckled his sword from his belt. He held it out to Sir Philip. The knight grabbed it at once and stood proudly at attention. Amber felt a tap on her shoulder. She looked over. Gawain was looking at her expectantly. She blinked. "Oh, you're asking this time? Well, let's go in then. I'm not scared of a rock." Gawain held up his finger. "Wait, before you do, leave your metals behind." Amber faltered. "All right." Amber removed 2 daggers from her belt. She then pulled out 2 talismans she kept in her sleeves. She removed her necklace, 2 more daggers from her boots, a bag full of various thieves' instruments, and a pocket watch. The last one Gawain recognized as something Amber had snatched from the butler in Tanzantown. Yet for the moment, it wasn't worth arguing over. Gawain looked at the small mountain of gadgets and gizmos. Then he turned back to Amber. She shrunk a bit. "And your coin bag?" Amber's mouth dropped. "What? No, absolutely not." Gawain said nothing, but he looked at her pointedly. After a moment she sighed, and removed a bag bulging with coins. She handed it cautiously to Sir Philip. "I'll have you know I've counted them all. Every last one of them. If you take even a copper, I'll notice it." Sir Philip's back seemed to straighten even further. "Upon my honour as a knight, they shall be as you have left them." Amber hissed at the knight. "Don't proclaim so loud." She looked around and laughed performatively. "Actually, there's no money in there. Barely a few buttons." Her counterfeited casual expression glared at Sir Philip, who just nodded. Gawain chuckled. 2 opposing worldviews. One values bombastic oaths and the other discreet dealings. Dame Heidi cleared her throat. "I can go in with you too." Gawain met her gaze and held up his hand. "Keep guard with Philip. If we know that the sphere can mess with magic, you'll be of more use out here." She nodded and retreated with a bow. "As you say, just be careful." Gawain felt a slight heat come to his cheeks and he nodded awkwardly. Turning away from Heidi, Gawain and Amber approached the tent. Gawain cautiously lifted the screen. The sphere was unchanged in the middle of the big tent. However, 3 grown men were stuck to it, like wasps in a trap. 2 of them were clearly volunteers, and one an official soldier, the captain of the watch. Gawain almost laughed. It was an absurd sight. Nearby, Pittman the Druid was having a conversation with the squad leader. "So your situation is evidently due to bad luck. Do you really not want to try the changing of luck rite of the Druid sect?" Gawain cleared his throat. Pittman jumped to his feet. "Don't try and swindle my soldiers, Pittman. Druid sects have no changing of luck rite." He turned his attention to the trapped men. "Who was the first to be stuck?" The captain of the watch, a man with a full beard, gestured with his head at the taller of his 2 compatriots. "Locke there was the first to be trapped, my lord. I wasn't initially attracted, the thing just grabbed my sword. But then I got curious, and suddenly I got pulled in." The 3rd soldier, a little thin man, chimed in. "Same, I tried to help the captain and got stuck too." Gawain rubbed his chin and walked forward. He surveyed the soldiers' condition. They seemed to have limited movement, but every bit of metal was completely stuck to the sphere. There was a long sword stuck to the top, right next to Locke's head. He looked downward. A metal ring of some description had fallen off of someone's armor. Yet there it sat on the ground, undisturbed by whatever force kept the soldiers fused to the surface of the ball. Gawain crouched down, picked up the ring, and walked up to the sphere. He tapped the ring against it. It didn't stick. There was no magnetic force there at all. Lauren Pittman walked up, drumming his fingers together thoughtfully. "I checked earlier. There is no magnetic force. They're stuck on the sphere like they've been welded to it, so unless we cut them out of their armor, they'll be trapped there for the time being." All 3 of the militiamen seemed to deflate upon hearing this statement. Gawain turned to the Druid. "Good to hear that you're doing more for our clan than hawking your next scheme." He turned back to the sphere. "It sounds like some sort of magic then. Amber, could you take a look from the shadows? See whether you can dispel it from there." The shadows existed together with the real world, but on a different plane. As such, the shadows were very suitable for disrupting the magical power operating in the real world, or even carrying out cross-dimensional damage. This was why the rogue profession had the most skills for undoing magic traps and breaking seals, and as a pet of the shadows, Amber was a master in this aspect. The rogue snapped a quick salute and spun in place. Her body became hazy and illusory. Her entire being had entered the space between the real world and the shadow realm. Some blurred shadows extended from beneath her feet and gradually blended into one with the shadow around the rock ball. As Amber worked her tricks, Gawain walked over to the ball and gave it a little push. He gasped. When they had brought it from the ruins, it had been easy to move, but now it felt like it weighed more than a ton. Gawain braced his back against the sphere and shoved, but to no avail. It stayed in place. Gawain righted himself. It was practically weightless when we brought it here. Pitman nodded. That might be a magic effect. I reckon this is its true weight, as heavy as an isometric black gold marble. All of a sudden, Amber leapt out of her shadow state and fell on her bottom. She groaned in pain. Gawain strode over and helped her to her feet. What happened? Amber shook her head in confusion. I don't know. There seems to be an energy field around this ball. I'd only extended my consciousness to it, but it threw me back almost immediately. The druid gasped. He yelped. Wait a minute, it showed signs of life earlier. Signs of life? Gawain was stunned. Not only of the druid's assertion, but also that the old man dared to yell at him. Pitman shifted closer to the sphere. Weak signs of life appeared after what Amber just did. The druid grabbed a dried and crumpled piece of leaf. All signs of life disappeared a split second later. I've never seen anything like it. Amber looked fearfully at the rock ball. What the heck? Could this thing really be sentient? The three soldiers stuck to the sphere looked at each other and gulped at the same time. Gawain frowned at the old druid, whose repertoire of skills he still doubted. You couldn't have sensed wrong, could you? Pitman glared. Impossible! I'm a true druid, a professional from the Nature and Soul faction. How could I make a mistake in such a basic domain? Gawain frowned harder. Didn't you say you were from the Forest Heart faction? Pitman was stunned. Oh, was that what I said the previous time? He shot a look at Amber. Which faction did you tell people I was from? Pitman changed the topic as quickly as he could with a big old laugh. Whatever the case, my senses are not wrong. Sensing life in all things is the foundation of being a druid. All druid spells rely on this foundation. Moreover, look, this is proof. He showed the dried and crumpled leaf to Gawain again. The leaf grew back into a bright, verdant and healthy state, as if freshly picked from a branch. Pitman circled the sphere. Although it appears to be lifeless on the surface, there is no doubt that signs of life exist within it. It can be said to be in a deep, heavy slumber, or perhaps still metamorphosing into its final form. Amber batted her eyes. Hold on, this couldn't be an egg, could it? Gawain faltered at the thought. If the thing that the Gondolian researchers had been studying for such a long time in the mountains was really an egg, would they really just leave it behind? An even more puzzling question struck him. What living thing would have an egg this big? An answer appeared in his mind the moment he asked it. A dragon. Amber and Pitman squabbled over a list of different creatures and elemental beings, but Gawain slipped into his own mind, finding a dragon's egg right after transmigrating into this world. It felt too coincidental. Even so, dragons are said to have lifespans of tens of thousands of years. The hatching of an egg could take thousands of years alone. They could spend their whole lives brooding the egg, only for Mama and Papa Dragon to come take it away once it is hatched. And Cecil territory is by no means equipped to fight a dragon. Gawain, the Grand Duke snapped back to reality, spurred by Amber ramming her head into his chest. All the air nearly left Gawain's lungs. He recovered and pulled on Amber's ear. Are you out of your mind? You didn't have to hit me with your head. Amber pulled herself away from Gawain. Why were you in such a daze? Gawain let out a big sigh and directed his attention back to the rock ball. I was wondering if this was a dragon egg. Everyone stopped. The soldiers stuck to the sphere looked at each other again and gulped louder. Pitman scratched his beard. A subspecies of giant dragons known as metallic dragons are indeed known to control metals and affect the flow of magical power. If we're really thinking of this object as an egg, then it is highly likely that it is a dragon's egg. Gawain shot a look at Pitman. Then do you know how to free these 3 soldiers? Pitman shrugged. That I do not. It is useless even if I do. If this really is a dragon egg, how could the ability of a low-level druid like me be enough to handle it? Giant dragons are a legendary species. This might just be an egg, but giant dragons have magical power equivalent to intermediate human mages when they are merely an egg. Gawain shook his head. So after working hard for half their lives, humans couldn't even compare to a mere zygote of a dragon. At this time, Amber suddenly looked over. Aren't you a legendary hero? You've chopped up archmages like chopping onions, right? Can't you take care of it? Gawain spoke with furrowed brows. The abilities of knights and mages are different. Gawain also knew that the legends of his heroic exploits were all mostly exaggerated over time. Even if they were partially true, the Gawain now was not the Gawain of old. He couldn't be confident that the same powers from 700 years still carried over. And even then, even if all the legends were true, Gawain of old could never handle a dragon alone. Gawain stepped forward after some careful thought. Let me give it a try. Even though it could be called a magical power too, a knight's abilities were different from a mage's. The majority of abilities Gawain could remember involved using a sword to slash at the enemy. But to deal with this egg, perhaps some basic knight skills could come in handy. Gawain pressed a hand on the sphere's rough surface. The 3 soldiers anchored to the rock ball turned their heads over nervously. They did not know what the Grand Duke planned to do. Moreover, they were unsure whether they would become sacrifices in this process. Gawain noticed the soldiers' gazes and reassured them with a smile. Don't worry, I'll be steady. Gawain used a knight skill to sense the magical power within. A new field of vision appeared in his mind. Everything in his sight went into varying shades of white. This was the distribution of magical power within a small radius around him. Though he wasn't seeing as clearly as mages in meditation did, it was enough to point out the flow of magical power. He saw an extremely thin layer of mist shrouding the inside of the tent, and within the mist there seemed to be a subtle flow. There were several points of convergence that the mist swirled slowly around. The 2 slightly stronger ones were Amber and Pitman standing nearby, with another 3 extremely weak balls of magical power gathered together, clearly the 3 soldiers. Gawain looked at the supposed dragon's egg. Magic appeared like a white mist, drifting and swirling around them, but the egg? It was absolutely pitch black, a darkness without light, without any detail whatsoever. This meant 2 things. Either this sphere was something that by no means should exist in this world, or it had absorbed all magical effects directed at it. The first possibility could be eliminated because both Heidi and Pitman had sensed magical power coming from inside the sphere. Though the power was very strange, and unlike the known forms of magic, it did exist, so this sphere must have entered a kind of self-protection. Gawain cautiously guided his consciousness to focus on this round splotch of darkness. Amber trying to shadow walk around it had proven the strength of this self-protection. An excessively violent prodding would very likely cause me to be pushed away like Amber was. Gawain closed his eyes. He had no clue whether a dragon's egg could communicate, but he had to try. He called out with his magic. Do you hear me? At first, there was no response. Do you hear me? After a few seconds, he heard something. He heard buzzing sounds reverberating in his mind, and he was sure it wasn't just his imagination. This sphere was grumbling softly to him. Gawain's spirit was instantly revived. He stabilized this fragile magical connection and sent his first greeting. Hello, I mean no harm, you can call me Gawain. The clicks and buzzes coming from the ball became clearer and clearer. These were mere fluctuations in magic, but as they grew louder he heard grumbles turn into words. The genderless voice had a metallic tone. Is the outside safe now? Gawain suppressed the pounding of his heart and did his best to convey his sincerity. It is very safe here. You can be completely assured. He waited for a response in his mind. The metallic voice vibrated out after a beat. I don't believe you. Well, of course it wasn't going to be that easy. To be honest, Gawain never thought that he would actually form a magical link with a rock-like sphere. Amber piped up behind Gawain. "What's going on?" Gawain held a hand up and did not say anything. The message was clear. He was focused. If no one else was watching, he would have cleaved the stone in two for its remarks. But Gawain calmed his mind and resisted the urge to spank the supposed dragon egg. Instead, he formulated a response in the subtle language of magic. "What good do I get from lying to you? The laboratory used to lock you up back then has been abandoned for 1,000 years. The bull kept silent for a while, seemingly in thought. Then, with the same metallic tone, it spoke. "Don't try to fool me into leaving my shell," Gawain started. "I'm speaking the truth. If you don't believe me..." The egg's voice interrupted. "Don't try to fool me into leaving my shell." All the veins in Gawain's forehead bulged. "It's your business if you want to stay in the shell. But first release my men." When the bull spoke again, it had a curious tone. "What? Your men? What men?" Gawain didn't detect feigned ignorance. "You attracted 3 of my soldiers to your body." The bull stayed quiet for an even longer period then. It let out a shocked cry. "So there were also people stuck to my steel plate?" As its words fell, Gawain heard thumps. The 3 soldiers were instantly released, no longer glued to the surface of the ball. They frantically crawled further away from the ball and dumped their armors, weapons, and all sorts of metal belongings on the ground. All this time, Gawain remained focused on the ball. "Why did you attract their armor and weapons?" The ball responded in a bold and justified tone. "Can't I get something to defend myself? Heavens know what other vile tricks you mad barbarians have." Gawain frowned. "The research facility from those days is long gone. How would I know what the people who captured you had done? Don't try to fool me into leaving my shell." Gawain didn't know what to say. He, Mr. Know-it-all of this world, was losing a debate to a zygote. Gawain tried some more questions and different angles to get the supposed dragon egg to open up. Each time it inevitably responded with a petulant, "Don't try to fool me into leaving my shell." Gawain removed his hand from the surface of the ball with a tired expression. He cut off the magic sensing and the link, looking up at Amber and Pitman. Amber had been pondering seizing this opportunity to steal some riches when Gawain set rose and looked at her. The half-elf broke out in a cold sweat. "Are you okay? Your expression kept changing really often. I thought you were going to spontaneously explode." Gawain sighed. "I established communication with this sphere. It has a mind." The most surprised person wasn't Amber, but the druid Pitman beside her. The little old man rushed to the ball right after, but wound up hesitating, afraid to press his hand on it. "A mind? A dragon egg is mature enough to formulate thoughts? This is the most inconceivable matter. It's a profound mystery that no scholar or druid in the world has ever discovered." Gawain shook his head. "We still cannot confirm that this is a dragon egg." Still, his words were of no use. Pitman sank into an inexplicable excitement, muttering about how he'd started writing this new discovery into a book to be sold to the sacred dragon kingdom in the north. Taking into consideration that the sphere had refused all contact, Gawain could only opt to leave it there. However, to prevent this supposed egg from stirring up more trouble, he moved away all metal items within a 10-meter radius of the tent. He planted a circle of obsidian slabs around the sphere to impair magical power. And finally, the sphere was tied up with layer upon layer of strong ropes. Thick wooden posts fixed it to the ground. While arranging all of this, Gawain recounted the entirety of his interaction with the ball to Heidi. Surprisingly, the mature and steadfast Heidi also suspected the ball to be a dragon egg. It seemed as though jumping to dragons was a trendy line of thinking in this world. Heidi stroked her chin. "This egg was probably stolen by the archmages of the ancient Gondolian Empire. I've heard that the giant dragons did indeed appear on the continent 1,000 years ago. The sacred dragon kingdom has records of that. Although those dragon worshippers have always been a little strange when it came to topics involving dragons, they are the most reliable source about when and where giant dragons have appeared. This point in time matches when the facility was constructed." Heidi looked at the egg, now encased in wood and ropes. Judging by the dragon egg's attitude toward humans, The archmages of the Gondolian Empire had clearly used underhanded means in the process of obtaining this egg and weren't exactly amicable as they researched it. Gawain pursed his lips. That goes without saying. They left it to rot in the laboratory. He stood up after making the finishing touches to the egg's new home and joined Heidi. I suspect it's been in a slumbering state since. Those archmages had probably used some method to suppress its soul because that egg has absolutely no memory of 1,000 years going by. When we brought it out from the facility, I'm afraid we destroyed the seal left by the mages 1,000 years ago. Heidi looked to Gawain. How do you plan on handling it? If it really were to be a dragon egg, then we can't do anything to it. Legend says that giant dragons are a species that holds grudges, and they especially value their eggs. The Gondolian archmages from back then might not fear the wrath of dragons, but all of us would be incinerated. No one alive had ever seen a true gigantic dragon, but there wasn't a lack of descriptions about them. Regarding their temperament, classification, preferences, and even diet, this continent had countless books making a fuss about these mythical creatures. A number of these books came from accounts of giant dragon specialists, while several came from the northern sacred dragon kingdom. The latter boasted themselves as descendants of dragons. They used resplendent yet terrifying terms to describe the dragon ancestors, and Heidi chose to believe the most dangerous part of those descriptions. Gawain furrowed his brow. We'll first leave it alone there for a few days. Don't have anyone disturb it. Let it believe that there is indeed no one doing experiments on it. Then I'll think of a way to build up trust. With that, he let out an uncontrollable long yawn. The drowsiness from being woken up in the middle of the night and the fatigue of using his night magic came crashing at once. Go back and have a rest. We'll see how it all develops. He and Heidi and the gathered crowd dispersed. A yawning Amber also disappeared from sight through her shadow walk. Gawain took one last look at the dragon egg tent being watched from afar by the soldiers. Shaking his head, he turned and walked toward his tent. He sat on his bed but did not go to sleep immediately. Instead, as a habit, he focused his attention and called upon the satellite view from the sky in his mind. After ensuring that there weren't any magical fluctuations near the dragon egg, and that there were no new alerts from the satellite, Gawain let out a small sigh of relief and closed his eyes. However, the moment before he did, his peripheral vision caught some indistinct faint light in the dark corner of the tent. Gawain shot up. The light wasn't an illusion, it came from the big basket beside his desk, the basket filled with Rebecca's haul of failed cement, of clumps of grey rocks that looked more like rotting wood. But when Gawain got a closer look, he saw a faint glow shimmering from the pores of the rocks. Though weak, their luster looked like the stars in the sky. At seeing the glow from the basket, Gawain's sleepiness instantly dissipated. Gawain rushed forward and plunged his hands into the burned rocky rubble. Billows of soot and dust rose as he shifted through the waste, but Gawain didn't care if he soiled his clothes. The mystery was too compelling. He sifted away the burned rocks and found the source of the glow. In the middle of this basket filled with charred and melted rocks were a series of crystals, smaller than a fingernail. Gawain picked up one of the burned rocks that didn't glow and he crushed it in his hand. Just as he anticipated when the outer shell broke away, the rock opened to reveal more glowing crystals, like the inside of a geode, but imbued with a magic similar to the crystals he had found in his treasure vault. A certain instinct had him activating his own magic-sensing ability. The world shifted into glowing shapes, and Gawain could see a shimmering cloud surrounding these tiny glowing objects. He nodded to himself. So they do contain magical power. Gawain picked up one of the smallest glowing pieces in the basket and held it before his eyes. He pinched it. The object was hard as a rock, but Gawain squeezed harder, and eventually it shattered in his hands. As the crystal crumbled into dust, it ceased glowing and its magical power dissipated. Gawain frowned. He thought about summoning Dame Heidi to his tent, but quickly dismissed the notion. The mage was likely asleep and she struggled to rest with all the tasks she had before her. His mind whirring, Gawain sat back down on his bed. He lay down, attempting to quiet his brain from more curious questions. They would all have to wait until the next day when he could go to Dame Heidi's tent. Darkness fell over the Cecil settlement. Lady Knight's welcoming domain embraced the pioneers and brought with it no dangers. At least not this time. Gawain slept lightly. The moment he saw grey light filtering through the bottom of his tent flap, up he hopped. He quickly washed using his basin and strode across the campsite. Over his shoulder, he carried a sheepskin bag which held those glowing crystals. There was no gold that glittered quite like an early morning sunrise, even in this world with the strange sun. Soon, he was at Heidi's tent. But he found it empty, so he quickly turned his footsteps toward the laboratory. This magic laboratory was situated at the southeastern corner of the camp, near the dark mountains. It was the only house in the entire camp that took up a sizable area and was primarily made out of stone and wood. Even without extra furnishing, it could be considered the mansion here. This was not due to Heidi's aristocratic pride, but rather to protect the surrounding environment. Heidi didn't need to elaborate to the builders why constructing a large house out of stone would be the best protection they could have from magical experiments. Mages were beings who were rather particular about being practical. As soon as it was erected, people in the settlement regarded Heidi's laboratory as a mysterious place, with a strange aura about it. In the eyes of laymen, this solid yet grand building was filled with a mysterious aura. Amber was fond of telling stories at the campfire to anyone who'd listen, that Heidi was mixing potions like a forest witch, but she dared not confirm any of these tall tales without risking a beating. The door creaked open and Gawain popped his head in. He saw Heidi there in the midst of the large room, her attention devoted to a pile of crystals on her desk. The exceedingly spacious circular desk was divided into 3 parts. One part was engraved with magic circles with all sorts of magic materials arranged around them. Another part was used to set out various bottles and jars and alchemy tools, whereas the last part only had a set of equipment, and that was the crystal resonator they had purchased from Tanzantown at a high price. The crystal resonator was specifically engineered to study the interior of those strange rocks. This was an outstanding creation from the mages of this world. Gawain found it such a striking difference from other crude technologies in this world. It had a pedestal, which was its core. Brass gears fixed 3 natural magic crystals of different sizes in place on its base, and around this centralized platform were numerous independent circular man-made lenses with adjustable angles. Before every piece of lens was a grey upright frame for imaging. This could be said to be the most expensive item in the whole laboratory. Heidi was always cautious when she used it. Needless to say, Rebecca wasn't allowed to touch it. Gawain saw Heidi place a light purple crystal in the middle of the crystal resonator. The surrounding magic crystals started to hum and glow. Soon the crystal started humming. Gawain's mouth dropped slightly open. It was as if the crystals were singing, harmonizing in an otherworldly melody. As the sound reverberated through the room, Heidi rushed from one lens to the other, adjusting and tweaking them. Light started to glow and pass through the objects, like a projector from Earth, and it cast an image onto the grey frame. As the rune structure came into focus, Heidi quickly pulled out a piece of parchment and began sketching on it with a piece of charcoal. She wasn't wearing her gloves. Her hands, in fact, were quite grimy. It seemed she was studying those ancient military-use crystals from the vault in the mountains. Then the mage's head popped up and her eyes met Gawain's. "Oh! Ancestor!" She blinked, surprised. "What brings you here? I expected you to be inspecting the farms or working on your blueprints." Gawain strode into the room cautiously, keeping his head on a swivel, in case there were any delicate experiments he might disrupt. "I have some things that I would like to show you." Gawain met Heidi by her desk. He held up his sheepskin bag. "May I?" Heidi motioned to an empty corner on her desk. As Gawain set the new crystals on the table, he took note of Heidi's scribblings. "You're studying the magic circles within those ancient crystals." Heidi rubbed the back of her head uncomfortably. "Yes, I'm sorry to say I'm not making a lot of progress." She trailed off as she noticed Gawain place what appeared to be ordinary rocks on the desk. Gawain answered her question before she had time to voice it. "They're the waste that came from Rebecca's last experiment, but I found something interesting in it." He took one of the rocks and struck it on the desk. The rock split open and revealed the glowing crystals within. Heidi gasped. Her eyes widened. "What are they?" Gawain shrugged. "That's why I brought them here. Can your crystal resonator make out its structure?" Heidi picked up the glowing geode and stared at it. She clearly hadn't expected anything to come out of Rebecca's slipshod experiments. She frowned. She pulled out one of the biggest crystals she could find, which wasn't much larger than a grain of rice. "It's too small to examine. Do you have any bigger ones?" Gawain shrugged. "This is the biggest piece." Dame Heidi nodded. "All right, I'll try my best." Heidi carefully removed the ancient crystal she had been studying. "I'll do my best." Heidi took a pair of tweezers and used them to place the tiny crystal in the resonator. Then she activated the 3 magic crystals. After a brief wait, some blurred lines appeared on the screens around the resonator. Unlike the images from the ancient crystal, they were almost indistinct. Gawain sighed. Heidi clicked her tongue. "This structure, it is definitely a man-made crystal, and the pattern is regular. It seems they should be able to absorb external magical power." She held out her hand, and the crystal glowed in the resonator. But nothing changed on the resonator's projection. Suddenly Heidi gasped. "These can store magical energy!" Gawain stared fixedly at the central pedestal of the crystal resonator. On the pedestal, the man-made crystal was radiating a white glow that could be observed with the naked eye. It seemed that as magical power filled it, its brightness would also grow. "So the more magical energy they consume, the more they glow." Heidi didn't answer. She was too busy pouring magical energy into the individual crystals and taking down notes based on their reactions. Gawain cleared his throat. "So this is a man-made crystal that can store magical power? Then how does its maximum capacity compare to a natural crystal? The stability? I see it's been glowing the entire time. How is its self-consumption rate?" Heidi waved her hand by her ear agitatedly. Hold on, I need to do more serious tests." She picked up the tiny crystal and walked towards the side with the magic circle used for analysis. Its self-consumption problem shouldn't be too severe. Although it is glowing, it is mainly the drifting magical power in the atmosphere that is resonating due to the influence of the crystal. There isn't much loss of the stored magical power in the crystal, so it should be able to store magical power for a very long period of time. As she explained, Heidi placed the crystal into a dish made of ruby with a trough around the center. She hummed a magical incantation. The magical circle glowed. The glowing crystal cracked, then shattered. Gawain and Heidi stared at the crystal shards in mute astonishment. The feeling of failure hung in the air like breaking wind in a crowded theater. After a moment, Gawain spoke. "This means star-raising has failed, right?" Heidi looked at her ancestor, baffled. "What?" Gawain coughed awkwardly, covering up his subconscious mistake. Sometimes references slipped into his speech too easily, and he needed to curb them. "I mean, what's happening? The magic overexerted itself." Heidi crouched down over the tray and examined the remaining traces of magic that were visible on the ruby disc. She removed a loose crystal lens and held it before her eyes, using it to amplify the sight of magic. Gawain watched her expression closely. The look of excitement in Heidi's eyes slowly faded away. She set the lens down on the ground and let out a huge sigh. "I'm sorry, ancestor. I'm afraid this is the inherent defect of crystals like this." Putting his hands on his hips, Gawain regarded Heidi curiously. A vague sense of foreboding made his stomach knot slightly. Defect? Is it single-use only? This would limit the crystal's usefulness, certainly, but Gawain could work around that. After all, even though they wouldn't have the stability of high-quality crystals, more fragile ones could still have some utility. After all, these crystalline solids that Rebecca created might be one of the first types of man-made crystals that had any potential for magical use whatsoever. Yet Heidi shook her head. "The problem isn't that. If it was single-use, that'd be one thing. The problem is that one can only put magical power into the crystal. There's no way to withdraw it. Gawain laughed in disbelief. How can that be possible? Heidi stood and pinched the bridge of her nose. She strode over to the desk and set the lens down upon it. The magical power lost its alignment, probably a side effect of the extraction. That turned usable magical energy into little more than waste energy. Waste energy. This was the specialized term mages used, also known as disordered magical power. This was a kind of magic that could not participate in any reaction nor be used to form a spell mold. It was worthless, like musical notes that had lost their tone. Disordered magical power was the byproduct of many spells. It was the slag left over after mages cast an enchantment. The most amount of disordered magical power was when the Azure Fount exploded, a year before the collapse of Gondolia. Sorcerers and mages had detected the build-up of disordered magical power within the fount months before the eventual calamity. Gawain paced around the magic circle. Useful magical power can be stored stably in the crystal, but only waste energy can be extracted. What use is a closet where you can only put things in? Gawain shook his head and sighed. Maybe. Now that we know Rebecca can create some crystals, it'll only be a matter of time before she invents useful ones. Heidi shrugged. Gawain clicked his tongue. In any case, let's move on. Any findings with the antique crystals? Heidi stood and dusted herself off. I'm sorry, Ancestor. There were many magic circles and rune arrangements within the crystal that were lost to us. The precision of the present crystal resonator is limited. I've restored part of the structure into a magic circle if you'd like to see. Gawain nodded. Heidi beckoned him back over to the desk. He followed. Heidi pulled out some stacks of papers and showed her drawings to Gawain. He recognized them immediately as magic circles, covered with annotations. Her gracefully arching handwriting felt at odds with the chaotic format that scientific note-taking required. Gawain studied the drawings, while Heidi shared her thoughts beside him. The magic system of the ancient Gondolian Empire is very different from today's. Their magic circles went in layers. Every layer was connected using key nodes, and those nodes were also a type of magic circle themselves when banded together, as if every layer was nested. It is impossible for the technology of today to build a magic circle with such a structure. I cannot imagine how the master mages of ancient Gondolia shoved this entire set of complicated runes into a tiny little crystal. Gawain chuckled. Heidi stopped talking and looked at him curiously. Gawain closed his eyes and spoke, retrieving a memory he found of little use beforehand. They prepared a room with almost no dust or suspended particles. Then they used magic conducting materials to build the magic circle on a high scale. Then they vacuumed out all the air in the room. Finally, they shined beams at the magic circle model using powerful magical power from the Azure Fount, and on the focal points of the illumination, they placed empty crystals that were to be processed. Through a unique polarization technique, magical power would brand the layered magic circle onto the interior of the crystal, layer by layer. Just like that, with one more illumination, the crystal would have a set of magic circles branded in it. 27 could be made in a minute. Heidi's pen landed on the floor as the mage dropped it in surprise. I never knew our forebears were so industrious. Gawain smiled. This is where my point of view differs from people of this era. You all believe in things being precious and rare, crafted specially to be passed down from generation to generation. But in my opinion, some of these tools need to be mass-produced in order for progress to happen. In time, however, even something as common as a nail can become a precious artifact if you weren't there when it was forged. Heidi cast her eyes downward. She was convinced she had disappointed her ancestor once more, so she wanted to hide her gaze. But Gawain was looking at the notes and didn't take notice. Just then, Gawain's eyes were suddenly caught by the magic circles on one of the drawings. What's this? Heidi lifted her visage and shook away her feelings of inadequacy. Oh, that's a diagram of a magic circle used to control a crystal's spontaneous explosion. Unfortunately, I lack the talent to extricate the friend or foe element of this spell. Gawain held up his hand, interrupting Dame Heidi's self-deprecation. Wait a moment. In your notes you say that this is different from other magic circles because it's protecting from a surge of energy within the crystals. Heidi faltered for a moment, then nodded. Yes, normally crystals have to be built to withstand bursts of energy from outside them, but in this case… She trailed off. Heidi was no fool. Slowly, she and Gawain turned their heads toward the laboratory bench, where the ruby tray still lay, shards of the broken crystal glinting in the lamplight. Gawain smiled. Lemonade from lemons. Gawain stood and walked over to the ruins of Rebecca's creation. The dust of the crystal shone, but not from magic this time. This was from the power of his own imagination. The magical power extracted from the crystals is stable within the crystals, but becomes waste energy when removed. So then why don't we find a way to simply activate the magic within the crystal? Heidi nodded eagerly. She looked upward, as if seeing diagrams before her very eyes. Of course! Such crystals are produced from rocks anyway, so they are not costly to produce. Mages with a sound mind would not usually use an explosive magic circle that would destroy a storage crystal with it. After all, storage crystals were expensive, so why ruin the magical artifact while removing its power? However, if there existed a type of crystal whose stored magical power had no way of being extracted, then they need not care if they had to break it to make it work. Rebecca's crystals would have to be purpose-made to be destroyed. Their properties were as straightforward and iron-headed as the person who invented them. Gawain leapt to his feet and seized the geodes. In his hands, his mind abuzz with possibilities. Countless bold ideas that made one jump for joy emerged in Gawain's mind. These thoughts were accompanied by bright flames and stirring whistles. They were the future. They were hope. They were the sword and shield to protect the people and land. They were the rays of light that broke up all the clouds gathered from the failures of creating gunpowder. It was art. Then Gawain paused, his feverish thoughts all froze in place as if his brain had been dunked in amber. Amber the crystal, not the half-elf. How do we carve a circle on a crystal that's no bigger than a grain of rice? Heidi stroked her chin. Perhaps we don't have to. What do you mean we won't need to? Despite Gawain's familiarity with magic, his knowledge was still quite lacking. Heidi pointed to the ancient crystals they uncovered from the Dark Mountains facility. I mentioned that the magic circles for combustion were discovered outside the more complex rune grouping. That's because this kind of magic circle has area of effect properties. Theoretically speaking, they would not even need to be engraved onto the crystal itself. A magic circle could detonate the crystals in a set area as long as a simple magical link exists between them. Heidi crossed her arms. In the words of a mage, these are interference model magic circles. They're small and simple and typically used by more powerful rune experts as a way to activate and shut off magical energy sources, or blow it all up, Gawain finished. He picked up some of the chalky residue of Rebecca's failed cement. Back in the days of Gondolier, Gawain remembered interference models being used for military-use crystals. Why did they carve these specific runes onto the crystal if they didn't have to? Because on the battlefield, nothing was guaranteed. A soldier with these crystals could fall to the enemy, their crystals shattered before proper explosion. So the Gondolian rune experts came up with an idea. They carved runes into the crystals to ensure that even if they were to break, they could still be detonated from a distance as long as some magical energy remained in the fragments. Gawain scrutinized the failed cement some more. He rubbed his chin as he thought to himself, I don't know what the effect would be if a huge amount of these crystals were gathered and set off at the same time. We still have no idea as to how they're formed. Only a small amount of the entire basket of samples that Rebecca sent over contained such crystals. Heidi observed Gawain's introspection. Though she was pleased these useless fragments could be put to use, she couldn't imagine how valuable they were outside of handy explosives. Lord Ancestor, you seem to be in high spirits. Gawain smiled. Of course, if we can put what we learned here to use, don't you think it could change everything? Heidi looked at the crystal fragments. They can become explosives, yes, and very useful for mages like Rebecca and myself. Soldiers can use them as supplementary weapons, but I cannot think of what else they can be used for. Gawain opened his mouth but closed it after a beat. He found it difficult to express exactly what he was thinking. He came from a world where explosives were used to break into mines and cut through mountains, where sheer energy fueled the tides of the Industrial Revolution. No one in this world would be able to conceive of these images. He simply pointed to Rebecca's basket. "I'll leave these samples to you. Do whatever you can to confirm all their properties. See what detonation magic circles work on them. I'm going to have a word with Rebecca on how she made these." Heidi nodded and then looked up, reminded of something. "Oh, Lord Ancestor, Rebecca is a diligent child, but she'd rarely been praised growing up, so—" Gawain smiled. "Don't worry. I'll shower her with praise. If what she created out of limestone powder and water can be reproduced en masse, I'll name these crystals after her. Be careful when you test the explosives here. This laboratory is only halfway finished. Make sure you have all the precautions in place." With that, Gawain left. Heidi sighed. She didn't have a chance to finish her sentence. Alone, she muttered the words to no one but herself. What I wanted to say was that Rebecca had rarely been praised growing up, so if you praise her too much, she might just become full of herself. And the last thing Heidi wanted was for her niece to become complacent. Heidi shook away the thoughts and got to work. Outside, Gawain left the magic laboratory and headed straight to the workshop where Rebecca had tried to bake cement. He did not find Rebecca there. Only a few workers cleaning up the waste and residue. "Where is Rebecca?" One of the workers pointed to the forge. "In the Cecil Steelworks, my lord." Gawain checked the waste in the workshop kilns. He found no similar crystals. Figured Rebecca must have tried altering parts of the formula and left for the steelworks. Gawain rushed over. The base matrix of the magic web must have been completed. When he arrived, he could see a group of apprentices assembling together the last pieces of a giant furnace. The courtyard of the steelworks had once filled with holes for the sake of burying the magic web. All of it was now properly hidden. There were no signs of magic circles at all except for the mithril stakes spaced out across the courtyard. Right. These are the sensors that will detect if anything happens to the magic web below. The surface of the stakes glittered with runes. Everything looked neat and tidy and ready to fire up. Empty spaces had even been demarcated to note room for expansion in the future. Gawain could not help but feel exceedingly satisfied. Rebecca had done exactly what she needed to do and more. All around the steelworks, people moved about, transporting tools, cleaning up leftover materials, but Rebecca could easily be spotted. She stood next to the large black furnace, directing everyone's movements with animated gestures. "Be careful, be careful! It must be placed exactly where I marked it. Do not cut corners. If it is not fitted accurately, the furnace will fall apart. No iron bars yet. We'll see about it after the runes have been carved. Show me the blueprints. Where is the drainage?" Gawain smiled, watching Rebecca immersed in her work. He did not have the heart to disturb her. Several serfs stopped and bowed, seeing the Grand Duke, but he simply admired the beautiful furnace. It stood menacingly at 4 meters tall, made with black stone powder to strengthen its compatibility with magical energy. It abandoned the traditional potbelly design for a rectangular chamber. Gawain was reminded of a pizza oven, except bigger in every way. At the upper end of the chamber, 3 chimneys ran parallel upwards, and below the chamber was a flat surface to lay out the metals. Complicated rune matrices covered the surface and they extended up all along the front of the furnace. Gawain saw something he didn't recognize, a rod under a metal plate connected to a pedal. Everything else he recognized. He saw the mechanisms to pour ore, remove slag, and drain molten metal. As a whole, Gawain hadn't seen anything like it even back on Earth. The furnace was more of a beast than a machine, a behemoth that would soon breathe fire for days on end. He was glad that it didn't match the blueprint that he gave Hummel. The old blacksmith did it. He improved on the design. Gawain smiled. Rebecca watched as everyone grew quieter and saw the reason why the Grand Duke's presence. She raced over at once. "Lord Ancestor, why have you come?" Gawain waved. "I was looking for you regarding another matter. But now that I've seen the progress here, I have to say, this is far better than I could have imagined." Rebecca beamed. Is that so? Do you really think that? Gawain patted her head. Of course. If you weren't able to handle it, I certainly wouldn't have allowed you to continue being in charge. But you're really doing amazing, Rebecca. Be more confident in yourself. I've said before, you are the pride of the Cecil clan. Upon hearing these words, Rebecca's eyes brimmed with tears. She held her head so high that her face was about to be raised into the sky. The two of them stood in the middle of a swirling symphony of labor and construction. Everything was coming together. Both of them could only relish in the sight of it all. Everything was coming together. Now that the furnace was finished and the magic web properly engraved, the new Cecil territory would have power. So much power. Gawain examined the black furnace and pointed to a steel plate and a pedal at the bottom. What is this added device for? It looked small and delicate, likely forged by a hammer. A part of it had been piped to an obsidian slab below. Rebecca smiled. Oh, you mentioned wanting a switch for the magic web that even the apprentices could control. I came up with the design myself. She pointed at the steel plate on the pedal and the obsidian slab below the furnace. I carved 2 halves of a magic circle on each. Pressing down on the pedal moves the steel plate, therefore rendering the rune deactivated. When placed back together, the magic circle comes back together, and the furnace will be powered once again. Rebecca stepped on the pedal with force to demonstrate. The steel plate fitted into the indentation at the bottom of the furnace. Gawain noticed the basic rune carved on the flip side. He smiled. It's a switch, simple yet full of creativity. Mages usually controlled magic circles by themselves. Doing this puts magical power right in the hands of laymen, specifically the blacksmiths. As the steel plate linked with the slab below the furnace, Gawain sensed a brief surge of magic in the air. Glowing patterns emerged along the stone floor and magic circles along the furnace also began to shimmer. The runes lit up one by one. In the blink of an eye, the firewood inside instantly burst into white-hot flames. Rebecca removed her foot. The steel plate stayed below the furnace with the help of gear latches. Gawain watched the wood burn and burn, the fire reflecting off of his pupils. This is far more primitive compared to industrial machines that I know. But considering all the resources and knowledge available in this world, this furnace is perfect. Rebecca stepped down on the pedal again. Step again, and the steel plate comes out. The runes along the furnace dimmed. At the same time, the fire inside slowly extinguished. The 2 halves of a magic circle separated as the steel plate rose out from under the furnace. Rebecca turned to Gawain. I named this the rune trigger. I used a very specific pair of runes to ensure this was the most stable combination. What do you think, Lord Ancestor? Gawain nodded emphatically. This will definitely do. He looked around. Where did Hummel go? Rebecca scratched her hair. Because we need even more black stones and red clay to build more new furnaces. He brought a few apprentices and people from the scouting party to look for materials in the mountains. The scouts mentioned that they'd seen black stones in the mountains when they returned yesterday. Gawain nodded, then remembered why he came to look for Rebecca. Yes, I have something for you. He brought out the darkish grey, hardened substance. Rebecca pouted. It's the rotten wood-looking waste from my baking. Gawain pointed in one of the holes of the substance. Look carefully. See those grains of crystalline? Do you remember how you baked these? Rebecca had never noticed the little bits of crystal. All of the waste had looked the same to her. Even so, Rebecca looked optimistic. I don't know exactly which batch of rocks this came from, but for each batch I recorded the different ratios I used, along with the duration in the kiln, the temperature, and how long I let them cool. If I try redoing the first few batches, I can figure out exactly how it was made. Gawain heaved a sigh of relief. Despite being only capable of producing fireballs, Rebecca was still a mage devoted to detailed research. Let's go. I can't explain it all to you yet, but what you made here could revolutionize the entire territory. While Gawain was trying to mass-produce explosives, a certain half-elf idly strolled the dense woods of the dark mountains. She had eaten and drunk to her heart's content, and if anyone asked her, she would say she was patrolling the borders of the territory. But of course, she was simply slacking off. She hummed and picked at her teeth, leaping between rocks and branches. The thick canopy kept her in the shadows. Her figure flickered from time to time. She shadow-leaped absent-mindedly, appearing several feet away in the blink of an eye. Her presence flickered, and she returned moments later with a fruit on her dagger. She took a few bites before casually tossing it away. As a master of shadows and a half-elf, the dark woods were a paradise tailor-made for Amber. Standing on the branch of a big tree, she comfortably stretched as she let out a relaxed sigh. Despite being intimidated by the notorious reputation of the Dark Mountains when she had first arrived, after staying here for a period of time, she realized that this place wasn't scary at all. It made sense, too. Several hundred years had passed since the Dark Wave. Those monsters were sealed away by both the Great Barrier and the Dark Mountains. This northern side of the range also had layers of protection. Amber stayed on the branch for a while. When she had enough of the cool breeze, she spread her arms and fell backward from the tree. Midway through the fall, she entered her shadow state. The power of the shadows wrapped her entire being and instantly brought her into a world parallel to the real world, which almost no one could step into. The Shadow Realm. The sounds of the wind, insects, and birds chirping in the forest disappeared. Amber landed gently and stood in this tranquil and grey world. Gone was the dense forest. Instead, Amber only saw overgrowths of grotesque rocks and rugged mountain paths. Withered tree trunks dotted a vague mountain path. Like jagged teeth, hideous dead branches pointed up at the Shadow Realm's gloomy sky. This black and white world was disconcerting, like the kingdom of the dead, but to Amber this place might as well be her home. It used to be difficult for her to enter into the Shadow Realm. It took most bandits extended meditation or the help of magic potions to consistently enter, but it had gotten easier and easier for Amber since she left the Cecil territory. As long as she focused, she could sense the border between reality and the Shadow Realm, and as long as she mustered the forces of the shadows, she would be able to cross. Amber was neither an expert on shadows, nor a mage with an acute sense of the supernatural. Amber was no fool herself, yet she knew that the greater ease of entering the Shadow Realm was not because of her own strength, but because something was changing between the world of shadows and reality. The border was growing weaker, if even only a little. Amber wandered about the Shadow Realm, enjoying this world's tranquility, even if it would haunt most people who witnessed the grotesque view. She wondered about these curious developments. Why has the border between the physical realm and the Shadow Realm grown weaker? Does anyone sense it as well? Amber thought about telling the fella who crawled out of his coffin. If she told anyone else, they might figure she was crazy, but the old geezer from 700 years ago was different. Amber smiled to herself and kept skipping along the Shadow Realm. While Amber continued her recreation in the woods, Gawain pored over a new basket of rocks that Rebecca had just presented him. Some time had elapsed since their conversation in the forge, and now she stood in his tent, anxiously awaiting his verdict on the fruits of her labor. He nodded approvingly. "New Rebecca crystals, I see." Rebecca flushed slightly at Gawain referring to the rocks by her own name, but she kept her mouth shut. Gawain gestured to his desk. "Here, let's put them there." Rebecca and Gawain hoisted the basket onto the desk. Gawain picked up one rock and broke it open to reveal the crystals inside. The rocks themselves were of varying quality this time. Some were loose, like thick grains of sand, and others were more like big rocks, solid at a glance, but would crumble easily to the touch like sandstone. But each of them had tiny crystals within, and as Gawain gazed at the stone in his hand, he was struck by how many crystals glowed within. He smiled. Rebecca had certainly made strides since making these by accident. "It seems you've happened upon quite the formula to make these Rebecca crystals." The young Viscountess herself stood across from Gawain. Her face was blackened with soot, her hair lightly singed from the heat. She awkwardly scratched behind her ear and laughed. "Do you really think you can name these Rebecca crystals? I mean, only impressive people can get things named after them." Gawain shook his head. "Nonsense. Many layabouts and dullards have had their names stamped on creations for all time. I reckon if we travelled back in time, as far back as we could still find people, we would be able to find some self-righteous idiot with the name Mr. or Mrs. Wheel. Impressive people are overrated. At least you invented these. Doesn't that make you at least a little impressive? He looked up at his descendant frankly. There's still quite a bit of room for improvement, but the name is still well-deserved. Rebecca giggled to herself and tried to hide her joy. It was a valiant effort, but ultimately an unsuccessful one. Gawain rolled his eyes. All right, let's save the giggles for later. How did you produce these? Rebecca shrugged. Well, I followed the formula you gave me, but it didn't work like you said it would. And the mixing was unsuccessful as well. So I had Hummel's apprentices inspect the furnaces, and they found that a big piece had fallen off the inside wall of the furnace into the mixture itself. Gawain gasped. The quartz sand of the furnace, that must have had something to do with this success. Rebecca nodded. Yes, and I found out that another important factor is the Dark Mountain range itself. Gawain cocked his head. The Dark Mountains? Rebecca rushed over to his desk and produced some papers. Gawain looked over them. Unlike Dame Heidi's lyrical scrawl, Rebecca's notes were chaotic and frantic, with several sentences overlapping each other, and half-formed thoughts trailing off into nothingness before being replaced by new discoveries. It was startlingly similar to his own writing, come to think of it. Fortunately, Rebecca had a good sense of her own scribblings. Yes! See, I compared some records and found that it wasn't just the quartz sand. We used limestone from the Dark Mountains in the mixture. When we dug up limestone from the White River, the effect was not the same. Gawain rubbed his chin. Quartz sand and limestone from the Dark Mountains. He was unsurprised at the reaction of the quartz, as it was a common ingredient in magical reactions, but he didn't know what made the limestone from the Dark Mountains special in comparison to any other rock. So he voiced this question aloud. Why should limestone from the Dark Mountains make a difference? Rebecca paused, her eyes staring blankly at her ancestor. After a moment, she mumbled, I was too excited about the success. I haven't thought about it. Gawain stood and paced about the tent. The Dark Mountains were enveloped by the Dark Wave. Perhaps even centuries later the stones are still marked by that incursion. It was not a scientific solution, merely a guess, but in this situation, that's all they had. The only thing that Gawain was certain about was that Rebecca crystals were absolutely unique in this world, at least in the Anzu kingdom. He turned to Rebecca. Can laymen complete this process? Rebecca waggled her head back and forth. Yeah, but most wouldn't understand the instructions you gave me. They're very precise and require direct proportions, and there's plenty of room for slip-ups. Gawain laughed. Naturally, the biggest difficulty in any labour force is human error. Getting accurate information across the camp would be difficult since all the literate people were already overworking. In order to best optimise the Cecil civilians, he would have to educate them all en masse. Creating an education system from the ground up was probably a necessary process, but provided a whole new series of challenges. Gawain groaned and rubbed his head. Building this new land was like fighting a hydra. One problem solved meant two more appeared in its place. Rebecca eyed Gawain curiously. Lord Ancestor, what's the matter? He shook his head and sat back down at his desk. Just thinking ahead. Continue working on this for now. If you have the time, your next project should be making the most efficient ratio. The least amount of fuel to produce the maximum amount of crystal. Also, we need a better way to extract them than cracking open the rocks. Rebecca nodded as she listened. When Gawain finished, she then leaned over with a gleeful smile, looking like the proverbial cat that ate the canary. Aunt Heidi told me you're planning to use such crystals as explosives. Gawain folded his arms. That's right. What do you think, Viscountess? Rebecca's eyes darted around thoughtfully. Suddenly she stopped. Her mouth opened slightly, and Gawain wouldn't have been surprised if a light bulb had suddenly appeared over her head. Have you thought of how to trigger the detonation? Gawain frowned. This was precisely the question he was deliberating over. He raised his eyebrows at Rebecca. Speak your mind. I can tell you have an idea. His descendant really couldn't hide her thoughts. She's lucky poker doesn't exist in this world. Rebecca cleared her throat. I studied the explosive magic circle for a bit. It won't require very much power to activate whatsoever. Gawain nodded. That's so. Then I realized something else, Rebecca went on. My rune trigger, the one I use for the forge, it produces only a tiny bit of magical power, but it is some nonetheless. Gawain sat forward. Hold on a moment. Are you sure this isn't power from the buried magic web? Rebecca nodded feverishly. I double and triple checked. I may not be able to cast spells besides Fireball, but I'm very good at detecting where magical energy is coming from. Gawain immediately sank into deep thought, turning the possibilities over in his head. After a spell, he looked up and jumped. He had almost completely forgotten that Rebecca was there. She had been standing there fidgeting during his entire reverie. Very good, very good. Then you can test out your rune trigger together with the explosive magic circle according to your ideas. You can get Heidi to help. Just tell her the order comes from me. Rebecca jumped for joy. She rushed to the tent flap and pulled it open. Then she paused. Lord Ancestor, we're making something new. Have you thought about what to call the, explosions that come out of these crystals? Gawain thought for a moment and replied solemnly, Flares. Rebecca furrowed her brow. Flares, really? Gawain nodded. Really? Flares. Rebecca looked up thoughtfully. She didn't understand the significance of this word, but like most things that her ancestor said, they must have some sort of significance. She bowed. Flares it is. Rebecca bounced out of the room. Yet Gawain was hardly satisfied, sitting alone in his tent. He shifted in his seat, picked up his pen and twirled it in his hand. Something felt off. There were so many concepts at war in his mind, fighting for space. Understanding a new world was like learning a new language, but from scratch. When he recovered from his daze, he realized he had scribbled a line of words on the rough paper. Magical power. What exactly is magical power? What is magical power? Gawain knew well that this would be a silly question to most people. It would be like asking a person what wind is, or sunlight, or the smell of a well-cooked roast. Magical power was magical power. He thought back to his conversation with Norris. People of his kind of faith would probably say that magical power was what the gods scattered in the world after they fell. That it was the aftermath of the gods' great battle as recorded on the eternal stone tablet. His thoughts turned to Dame Heidi and Viscountess Rebecca. Some among their mage class would probably describe magic as the bridge between the physical world and the elemental world. It could be felt, used, but never seen. The turbulence of the sea of ether, and represented changes in relative distance between the physical and the ephemeral. Gawain grunted and walked to the tent flap. He looked out over the settlement, filled with people, most of whom believed either of these hypotheses, gifts from the gods, or a tension between one world and the other. Neither satisfied him. He came from a modern world, a world where questioning what wind, sunlight, and smell were was not only usual but important. We need to find a way to explain magical power using data and models, not just dogma. Perhaps this could not be done in areas involving the gods, but since the mages were already used to analyzing spells like a chemist on Earth refining a formula, then they might be more amenable to further analysis of their fundamental power. He stared up at the gas giant which others referred to as the sun. Based on his months living here, he'd come to learn that magic was ubiquitous in Lorien. The people of this world had two ways of harnessing this force, directly casting spells or constructing facilities to harvest ambient power. Regardless of methods, magical power was drawn from nature and wasn't something that humankind could create out of thin air. Gawain tapped his fingers on the pommel of the sword of the founder. A trio of peasant women carrying lumber and buckets of water passed by. He nodded to them, and they bowed deeply, blushing at the attention from their leader. Gawain had come to suspect that magic was a kind of special matter, or something that passed through matter, like a static charge, or another such reaction of atoms. But now Rebecca's rune trigger gave him a new idea. He placed his hands together, deep in thought. What if magical power was a kind of energy field, and the various effects are fluctuations of that same energy. He thought that Rebecca's rune trigger might be something like an incomplete circuit. Once the trigger was used, the circuit was complete, but without it, no magic could flow. Basically, the source was nature, but the input of individual spellcasters merely activated something. Gawain reached into his pocket. He pulled out a flat black stone. He'd been using it as little more than a paperweight. He rubbed on it with his finger, drawing lines that resembled a whirlpool. Once finished with the swirls, he rubbed a dot into the middle. This was one of the basic runes he knew, the symbol for wind. No sooner had he finished the drawing, but he felt a cool breeze on his wrist as the air around the stone was stirred up, as if by an invisible fan. Gawain wiped across the stone, smudging away the rune. The wind immediately stopped. He shook his head. He found it remarkable that a simple drawing could harness the elements, even in such a simple way. The one thing his energy field theory didn't explain was storage crystals. If magic was constantly everywhere, then how could one store it? On Earth, one couldn't store light, sound, or radio waves, so how could magic operate on a completely different principle? Another one of the origin myths returned to Gawain's mind, one that made him laugh. Back in antiquity, ancient times, even for the original Gawain Cecil, monsters roamed the lands. These monsters had evolved to have rune structures in their very bones, and when humankind first hunted and fought them, they used the bone structure to harness that same elemental force. Whereas grasping mental powers and converting substantial runes into spell molds in the inner world came afterward. This legend was the kind that Gawain really liked. Although there were lots of assumptions in it, at least it didn't involve wars of gods and dragons. However, regrettably, many mages didn't seem to like this theory, and of course the priests hated it even more. It painted humankind, the wisest of all creatures, as stealers who had to follow behind uncivilized monsters at every step. This had those big figures who bragged and boasted themselves to be outstanding feeling extremely displeased. The hairs on the back of Gawain's neck stood up. He detected an aura, a familiar one, but one that smelled of fresh mud and grass. He reached out and slapped an invisible hand away from his pocket. "You won't take my silver stamp, Amber." Amber leaped out of her shadow state, rubbing her hand. "Wow, how did you do that? Are you sure you're really human with those reflexes?" Gawain smiled impatiently at Amber. "How would you know what good reflexes are? We've established you have the combat ability of a goose." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver stamp therein. He had used it lately to place the ducal seal on official edicts. "I know you've had your eyes on this, but you won't have it." Amber batted her eyes and looked away, embarrassed. "I just had some thoughts. It wasn't like I was going to do anything." Gawain raised his eyebrows quizzically. "Thoughts? Well, you've thought about it at least 12 times, if I recall correctly. Give it up. Now what do you want? It's not mealtime yet." Amber planted her hands on her hips. "I don't only come here for mealtime." Gawain chuckled dryly. "Yes, you do. That's how I know when to eat all 3 meals. Seeing you is a better signal than a dinner bell. But you didn't answer my question. What is it?" Amber groaned. "You're no fun, you fossil." "All right, I just wanted to inform you of something weird. Entering the Shadow Realm, it's lately become much easier to do." Gawain started. He was surprised that Amber had actually come on business, not just to stir up chaos as was her wont. Amber's mouth went flat. "What is it? I gave you some very interesting news, but you've become dumbstruck." Gawain coughed. "I just didn't expect you to have real news." He thought for a moment. "When you brought me into the Shadow Realm, back when we fought the Mist Wraith, you said it was your first time entering such a deep place." Amber grimaced. She grinned mischievously. "I lied a bit then. I thought it'd be too shocking. I've actually fully entered the Shadow Realm a few times. It wasn't easy, though. I needed to meditate and use rituals, and frankly, it got really boring. Sometimes I'd even have to chug a half bottle of shadow potion." Gawain blinked in surprise. "You drink yourself half to death to get into the Shadow Realm? What a little daredevil you are!" She shrugged nonchalantly. He clicked his tongue and stared out over the camp, deep in thought. "So the Shadow Realm is getting closer to our world. Do you think other scholars may have noticed this, like the people who study that plane? Amber grimaced. Not sure. Whatever might be happening, it's only just starting. I'm sure only people like me can sense it. Scholars can be capable theorists at best, but theory only takes you so far. You need to be up close and personal to sense this sort of thing. Gawain furrowed his brow. He didn't know if this was good or bad. In all of Lauren's history, there was no consensus about the space between the realms. It was entirely possible that the Shadow Realm drifted closer every now and again before drifting away. Do you have a theory of what could happen if the Shadow Realm came in contact with this plane? Amber's eyes widened. How would I know? Nothing good, I expect. Shadow magic is destructive. Mostly, anyway. People in this plane wouldn't react well to it. Gawain sighed. He set off walking across the field. Amber skipped after him. Why would you tell me this? I'm no warlock or shadow mage. Amber shrugged. It just felt like something I should share. Thanks for listening. I feel loads better. Gawain growled. He didn't like how flippantly this little half-elf treated him. Just then they stopped. A huge explosion echoed from the southeastern side of town. Amber ducked behind Gawain, quivering. What's going on? What's happening? Gawain turned and furrowed his brow. Some guards were already rushing toward the direction of the magic laboratory. He laughed, not quite believing it. Flares! Explosive flares! Rebecca has done it! Amber was about to ask what he meant, but before she could, Gawain had already started running toward the laboratory. There were enough protective runes around the building to keep the rest of the town safe, but Gawain mostly ran there to make sure the damage wasn't too bad, and to make sure that Heidi wouldn't thrash Rebecca for destroying her laboratory.